Harvey had hosted Family Feud for 17 years, and in that time he thought he had heard every possible family story, every imaginable configuration of relatives and relationships, every variation on what makes a family work. But on a warm April afternoon in 2024, an 83-year-old man named Thomas Washington would share a revelation so unexpected, so profoundly moving, and so completely counter to everything the audience assumed they knew about his family that Steve would literally stop the entire production, calling for cameras to keep rolling as he processed what he was hearing. What began as a standard game show episode would become a powerful meditation on sacrifice, unexpected grace, and the true meaning of family. Before we continue with Thomas's stunning revelation about who raised his children, if you're moved by these authentic stories about the unexpected heroes in our lives and the sacrifices people make for those they love, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories remind us that family is defined not by biology alone, but by who shows up when it matters most. The Washington family from Atlanta, Georgia arrived at the Family Feud studio with unmistakable energy and warmth. There were 5 of them competing: Thomas, the patriarch at 83, his 2 sons Marcus, who was 56, and Darius, who was 53, and 2 grandchildren, Thomas Jr., who was 31, and Alicia, who was 28. They presented as an exceptionally close family, finishing each other's sentences, laughing at inside jokes, and displaying the kind of comfortable affection that comes from decades of shared history. Thomas moved deliberately, using a silver-handled walking stick that had belonged to his father, but his posture was straight and his voice was strong. He wore a perfectly pressed charcoal suit with a pale blue tie, and his silver hair was cut short and neat. His dark eyes held a warmth and wisdom that immediately drew people to him. During the family introductions, Steve was immediately charmed by the Washington family's dynamic. They radiated joy and mutual respect in a way that felt genuine rather than performed for the cameras. When Steve asked Thomas about his family, the elderly man beamed with obvious pride. He explained that his 2 sons were both educators, Marcus a high school principal and Darius a college professor. His grandchildren had also pursued meaningful careers, Thomas Jr. as a social worker and Alicia as a pediatric nurse. Steve, always appreciative of families dedicated to service, complimented Thomas on raising children who clearly valued giving back to their communities. Thomas smiled at the compliment but said something that made Steve pause. "Mr. Harvey, I appreciate those kind words, but I need to be honest with you. I didn't raise these boys alone. In fact, the person who did the hardest work, the person who truly made them who they are today, is someone most people wouldn't expect." Steve's curiosity was immediately piqued. He asked the obvious follow-up question. "Well, their mother must have been an extraordinary woman." Thomas's expression shifted, becoming more serious though still warm. "Their mother was extraordinary, Mr. Harvey, but she passed away when Marcus was 7 and Darius was 4. Cancer took her in 1975. What happened after that is what I need to tell you about." The audience, sensing a significant story was about to unfold, grew quiet. Steve's entire demeanor changed from his typical game show host energy to the more thoughtful, pastoral presence he adopts when contestants share difficult experiences. He gave Thomas his full attention, and the production team, recognizing something important was happening, ensured cameras captured every moment. Thomas continued, "When my wife Carolyn died, I was 34 years old with 2 young boys, a full-time job as a bus driver, and absolutely no idea how I was going to manage. My parents had passed away years earlier. Carolyn's parents were elderly and in poor health. I was working long hours, sometimes double shifts, just to keep us afloat financially. I couldn't afford childcare. I couldn't afford to work less. I was drowning, Mr. Harvey, completely overwhelmed and terrified that I was failing my children." Steve nodded with understanding and compassion, clearly invested in where this story was going. Thomas took a breath before continuing. "I had a neighbor who lived in the apartment next to ours. We lived in a rough neighborhood in South Atlanta, the kind of place where people mostly kept to themselves and trusted no one. This neighbor was someone most people in the building avoided. She was a white woman in an almost entirely black neighborhood, which already made her stand out. Her name was Ruth Miller, and she was 68 years old, living alone, and people said she was strange. They said she muttered to herself, that she dressed oddly, that she probably had mental problems. People warned me to stay away from her, to keep my children away from her." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Steve's expression showed he was trying to anticipate where this story was going but couldn't quite predict it. Thomas continued, his voice growing thick with emotion. 3 days after Carolyn's funeral, I had to go back to work. I had no choice. I couldn't take more time off or we'd lose our apartment. I left my boys with a neighbor down the hall who said she'd watch them for a few hours. When I came home that evening, I found my children sitting in the hallway outside our locked apartment, alone, crying. The neighbor had put them out after just an hour, said they were too much trouble. Thomas paused, his hands gripping his walking stick more tightly as the memory clearly still affected him decades later. I was standing in that hallway, my two traumatized children clinging to me, both of us crying, and I had no idea what I was going to do the next day or the day after that. That's when Ruth Miller's door opened. She stood there in her house dress and slippers, looking at us with these sharp blue eyes, and she said, "Bring those boys in here. I'll watch them while you work. No charge, just bring them to me before you leave, and I'll keep them safe until you come home." The audience gasped softly, beginning to understand where this was going. Steve's eyes widened with recognition of what Thomas was about to reveal. Thomas continued, his voice now openly emotional. "I didn't know what to say. I barely knew this woman. Everyone said she was crazy, unstable, someone to avoid. But I looked at my crying children and looked at her face, and something in my gut told me to trust her. So the next morning, I knocked on Ruth Miller's door at 5:30 in the morning, and she answered immediately, already dressed, already prepared. She took my boys by the hands and said, 'Go to work. They'll be fine.' And Mr. Harvey, that woman raised my children." The last sentence came out as almost a whisper, and the studio erupted in gasps and exclamations of surprise. Steve's mouth fell open in shock. He took a step back, shaking his head in disbelief, trying to process what he had just heard. Thomas wasn't finished. Tears were now flowing freely down his weathered cheeks as he continued. "For the next 14 years, from 1975 until 1989, Ruth Miller watched my boys every single day. She got them ready for school. She helped with homework. She cooked their meals. She bandaged their cuts and dried their tears. She taught them to read and write. She went to parent-teacher conferences when I couldn't get off work. She sat in the emergency room with Marcus when he broke his arm. She was there for Darius's first day of kindergarten. She did everything a mother would do, and she never asked for a single penny." The audience was crying now, many people openly sobbing at the image of this elderly woman who had been dismissed and avoided by her neighbors stepping in to raise two young black boys in the 1970s South. Steve Harvey stood frozen, his hand over his mouth, shaking his head in wonder. Thomas continued, his voice breaking repeatedly. "I tried to pay her. Every week I would try to give her money, and every week she would refuse. She said, 'Those boys lost their mother.' I lost my daughter and grandson years ago, and they took part of me with them. Taking care of Marcus and Darius gives me a reason to get up in the morning. You're not taking that away from me by trying to pay me." Thomas paused to wipe his eyes before sharing more details that made the story even more powerful. Ruth was not a wealthy woman. She lived on a small pension from her late husband. She had very little, but whatever she had, she shared with my boys. When they outgrew their clothes, she somehow found money to buy new ones. When they needed school supplies, she provided them. When Marcus wanted to join the school band but we couldn't afford to rent an instrument, Ruth found a way to get him a saxophone. When Darius wanted books, Ruth took him to the library every week and helped him get a library card. She poured everything she had into raising my children. Steve finally found his voice, hoarse with emotion. "Mr. Washington, Thomas, I don't even know what to say. This woman, this Ruth Miller, she just decided to raise your children out of the goodness of her heart." Thomas nodded, smiling through his tears. "She did, Mr. Harvey. And she did it while facing prejudice and hostility from people in our building who couldn't understand why a white woman would dedicate her life to raising black children. People said cruel things to her. They questioned her motives. They suggested there was something wrong with her. But Ruth never responded to any of it. She just kept loving my boys and raising them with more dedication than most people show their own biological children." Thomas's son Marcus stepped forward, asking permission to speak. Steve immediately invited him to join his father. Marcus, a dignified man in his 50s wearing glasses and a suit, addressed the audience directly, his voice thick with emotion. "I want everyone to understand what Miss Ruth meant to us. When my mother died, I was 7 years old and my world ended. I was angry, confused, terrified, and grieving in ways I couldn't articulate. My father was working constantly just to keep us housed and fed. He was doing his best, but he was one person trying to do the work of two parents while also dealing with his own grief." Marcus continued, his composure cracking as tears began flowing. "Miss Ruth saved us. She didn't just watch us while Dad worked. She loved us. She talked to us about our mother and kept her memory alive. She held us when we cried. She celebrated our successes and encouraged us through our failures. When I was struggling in school and falling behind, Miss Ruth spent hours every evening tutoring me until I caught up. When I wanted to quit, she wouldn't let me. She believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Darius also joined them now, and the three Washington men stood together, supported by each other as they shared their story. Darius spoke next. "I was only 4 when my mother died, so I have almost no memories of her. Miss Ruth became the only mother I really knew. She taught me everything. How to tie my shoes, how to read, how to treat people with respect, how to stand up for myself, how to dream big despite our circumstances. She used to tell me, 'Darius, you're going to college. You're going to be somebody. Don't let anyone tell you different.' And because she believed it, I believed it too." Thomas reclaimed the narrative, wanting to share what happened in Ruth's later years. As the boys got older and needed her less, Ruth started to decline. She developed dementia in her early 80s. By then, my boys were adults with their own lives, but we all agreed immediately what needed to happen. Ruth had no family left. Her daughter and grandson had died in a car accident in the 1960s, and she had no other relatives, so we became her family. Marcus and Darius took turns staying with her, helping her, caring for her as her mind began to fail. When she could no longer live alone, we moved her into my house, and for the last 7 years of her life, we cared for her the way she had cared for us. The audience was completely undone, crying openly at this reversal, at the beautiful circularity of the care and love. Steve Harvey had tears streaming down his face, making no attempt to hide his emotion. Thomas continued, "Ruth Miller died in 1996 at the age of 89. She was surrounded by me and my boys and their families. Her last coherent words were spoken to Marcus. She looked at him and said, 'I did good with you boys, didn't I?' And Marcus told her, 'Miss Ruth, you did better than good. You saved us. You gave us everything.' She smiled and closed her eyes, and within an hour she was gone." Thomas paused, gathering himself before sharing the final crucial details. "We buried Ruth in our family plot next to my wife, Carolyn. Her headstone reads, 'Ruth Miller, beloved mother and grandmother,' because that's what she was. Not by blood, but by choice, by sacrifice, by love. She was the mother who raised my children when their biological mother couldn't. And everything good in our family, every success, every achievement, every moment of joy, it all traces back to Ruth's decision to open her door that night and take in 2 grieving children who weren't hers by any conventional measure, but who became hers through love." Steve Harvey stopped everything at this point. He signaled to the production team and said, "We're not continuing with the game right now. This is more important than any game. What we've just heard needs to be processed and honored." He turned back to Thomas and his sons. "Mr. Washington, Marcus, Darius, what you've shared with us today goes beyond a beautiful story. You've given us a masterclass in what family really means, in what love really looks like, in what it means to show up for people when they need you most." Steve continued, his voice breaking with emotion. "Ruth Miller didn't have to do anything for your family. She could have kept her door closed. She could have ignored your suffering. She could have listened to the people who said to stay away. But she chose love. She chose sacrifice. She chose to pour her life into raising children who weren't her own, who didn't look like her, in a time and place where that choice subjected her to prejudice and suspicion. And you, Thomas, you chose to trust her when everyone said not to. You chose to see her humanity when others only saw someone strange and different. And then you came full circle, caring for her in her final years. That is the most beautiful example of love and family I have ever encountered." The studio audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. People were crying, embracing strangers, clearly moved beyond what words could express. The Martinez family, the Washingtons' competitors that day, joined them on stage, hugging each family member and expressing how honored they were to have witnessed this story. The production crew, hardened professionals who had seen countless emotional moments, were openly weeping behind their cameras. When order was finally restored, Steve made a decision similar to one he had made in the past for other extraordinary contestants. "The Washington family, you've already won today. You won the moment Ruth Miller opened her door in 1975. You won every day she poured her love into your children. You won when you repaid that love by caring for her in her final years. But we're going to give you this $20,000 anyway, and I want you to use it however you think would honor Ruth Miller's memory." Thomas accepted graciously, then shared what they would do with any winnings they received. "Mr. Harvey, several years ago, my sons and I established a small scholarship fund in Ruth Miller's name. It provides assistance to single parents who need help with childcare and educational expenses. We've helped about 30 families over the years, but it's never been enough. This $20,000 will go directly into Ruth Miller's scholarship fund, so we can help even more families who are struggling the way I was struggling in 1975. The audience erupted in applause again. Steve shook his head in amazement. "Of course you did. Of course you established a scholarship fund, because Ruth taught you not just to receive love but to pass it on to help others the way you were helped. That's the ultimate tribute to her legacy. They proceeded with the game at Thomas's insistence, wanting to honor the show and the opportunity they'd been given. The Washington family won legitimately, their decades of closeness translating into the kind of communication and teamwork that makes families successful on Family Feud. When the episode aired 10 weeks later, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours, the clip of Thomas revealing who raised his children had been viewed over 100 million times across various platforms. News outlets internationally picked up the story. The narrative of Ruth Miller, an elderly white woman in the segregated South who chose to raise two young black boys despite social pressure and prejudice, resonated powerfully in a time of ongoing racial tension and division. Civil rights organizations embraced the story as evidence that individual acts of love and courage can transcend systemic barriers and prejudice. They pointed to Ruth's choice as an example of what allyship and solidarity can look like in practical terms, not grand political statements, but quiet daily sacrifice on behalf of people who needed help. Interfaith groups highlighted the story as embodying the core teaching of nearly every religious tradition: to love your neighbor as yourself, to care for the vulnerable, to see human need and respond with compassion rather than indifference. Childcare advocacy organizations used Thomas's story to highlight the ongoing crisis in affordable childcare that continues to devastate working families. They pointed out that while Ruth Miller's individual sacrifice was beautiful, families shouldn't have to depend on the chance kindness of neighbors to survive. The story became part of broader conversations about social support systems, the challenges facing single parents, and the need for comprehensive childcare assistance programs. The Ruth Miller Scholarship Fund experienced an unprecedented influx of donations. Within 3 weeks of the episode airing, over $2 million had been contributed by people moved by Ruth's story and wanting to help continue her legacy. The Washington family, overwhelmed by the response, established a proper nonprofit organization to manage the funds and expanded the scholarship program significantly. They hired staff, developed application processes, and began helping hundreds of families annually with childcare costs, educational expenses, and emergency assistance. Thomas, Marcus, and Darius became unexpected spokespeople for family diversity and the many forms that love and care can take. They were invited to speak at universities, conferences, and community organizations about their experience. Their message was consistent. Family is defined not by biology or race or conventional structures, but by who shows up, who sacrifices, who loves without condition. They challenged audiences to reconsider their assumptions about what families should look like, and to recognize the unsung heroes in their own communities who are quietly raising children, supporting neighbors, and holding communities together through individual acts of sacrifice. Educational institutions began using the Washington family story in courses on family studies, social work, race relations, and American history. Students analyzed Ruth's decision through various lenses: the courage it took to defy social expectations, the practical challenges she must have faced, the depth of commitment required to sustain her care for 14 years, and the reciprocal care she received in her final years. The story provided a counter-narrative to simplistic accounts of race relations in the 1970s South, showing that even in times and places characterized by division and prejudice, individuals could, and did, make choices based on common humanity rather than tribal loyalty. Psychologists and family therapists discussed the Washington family story as an example of chosen family and the powerful bonds that can form outside traditional biological relationships. Research on attachment and child development has consistently shown that what children need most is consistent, loving care from dedicated adults, regardless of biological connection. Ruth Miller had provided that essential care, and the thriving lives of Marcus and Darius demonstrated the positive outcomes that result from stable, loving environments, even when those environments don't match conventional family structures. Steve Harvey devoted a full episode of his talk show to exploring the themes raised by the Washington family story. He invited Thomas, Marcus, and Darius back, along with experts in childcare, family policy, and race relations. The conversation explored questions about what we owe our neighbors, how communities can better support struggling families, and what it means to love across lines of difference. Thomas shared additional memories of Ruth that painted an even fuller picture of her character, her humor, her wisdom, and her unwavering commitment to the boys she had chosen to raise. During that talk show episode, Marcus shared a discovery that added another powerful dimension to the story. After Ruth's death, while going through her belongings, they had found journals she had kept throughout the years she cared for them. The journals documented her daily experiences raising the boys, but they also revealed her thought process in making the initial decision to help. Ruth had written, "Everyone tells me I'm foolish to take on 2 young children at my age. They say I should mind my own business. They question why I would help a black family when I'm white, as if suffering has a color. But when I look at those boys, I don't see black or white. I see children who lost their mother. I see the daughter and grandson I lost. I see a chance to transform my grief into something beautiful. I see a purpose for whatever years I have left. How could I not help? What kind of person would I be if I closed my door on hurting children when I have the time and ability to ease their suffering?" The revelation of Ruth's journals, portions of which the family agreed to share publicly, provided insight into her motivations and her experience. She had written about the joys and challenges of raising Marcus and Darius, documenting their growth, their achievements, and her deep love for them. She had written about facing prejudice from some neighbors, but also about the gratitude Thomas showed and the loving relationship they built. She had written about watching the boys grow into fine young men and her profound satisfaction in having contributed to their development. The journals revealed a woman of deep faith, strong principles, and remarkable emotional intelligence who understood that love is expressed through action and sacrifice. The publication of excerpts from Ruth's journals sparked another wave of response. Her words resonated with people who had themselves made sacrifices for others, who had stepped in to help when they saw need, who had loved children who weren't their biological offspring. Grandparents raising grandchildren, foster parents, adoptive parents, step-parents, teachers, mentors, and countless others who pour themselves into nurturing young people saw their own experiences reflected in Ruth's writings. The journals validated their sacrifices and reminded them that their work mattered, that the love they gave would shape lives in ways they might never fully see. One particularly powerful journal entry that circulated widely was Ruth's reflection on her final parent-teacher conference before Marcus graduated from high school. She wrote, "The principal told me that Marcus has been accepted to 3 universities with full scholarships. She congratulated me on raising such a fine young man. I corrected her gently, saying I didn't raise him alone, that his father worked tirelessly to provide for him. But inside, my heart was bursting with pride. This child who came to me broken and grieving at 7 years old is now a confident, intelligent, compassionate young man heading to college. I didn't give birth to him, but I helped birth his future. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything." The scholarship fund continued to grow, eventually exceeding $5 million in managed assets. The organization expanded its mission beyond childcare assistance to include mentorship programs, pairing children from single-parent households with caring adults who could provide the kind of supportive presence Ruth had offered. The mentorship program specifically recruited older adults, recognizing that many seniors have time, wisdom, and desire to contribute, but lack structured opportunities to connect with young people who need them. The program became a beautiful way to honor Ruth's legacy while addressing contemporary needs. Thomas Washington lived for 3 more years after his Family Feud appearance, passing away peacefully in June 2027 at the age of 86. His obituary, published in major newspapers, focused primarily not on his own life, but on his relationship with Ruth Miller and the family they had built together across lines of race, age, and biology. At his funeral, his sons shared that their father's final words had been about Ruth. He had said, "Tell everyone about Miss Ruth. Make sure people know what she did. Make sure her kind of love doesn't get forgotten." The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including many families who had been helped by the Ruth Miller Scholarship Fund. Representatives from childcare advocacy organizations, mentorship programs, and community support services came to pay respects to a man whose story had highlighted the importance of their work. The speakers at Thomas's funeral emphasized that his greatest legacy was not anything he had accomplished professionally, but rather the way he had modeled gratitude, reciprocal care, and the expansion of family beyond traditional boundaries. Marcus and Darius continued their father's work, maintaining the scholarship fund and expanding its reach. They established an annual Ruth Miller Day of Service where volunteers throughout Atlanta and beyond engaged in acts of kindness for struggling families, providing free childcare, delivering meals, offering tutoring, making home repairs, and countless other practical expressions of love and support. The day became a living memorial to Ruth, celebrating her not with words alone, but with action that mirrored her own commitment to easing others' burdens. The story of Ruth Miller and the Washington family continues to circulate years after Thomas's appearance on Family Feud because it speaks to timeless human needs and possibilities. In a world often characterized by division, prejudice, and indifference to others' suffering, Ruth's choice to love across every conceivable barrier offers hope that individual humans can transcend the worst aspects of their cultures and times. Her story reminds us that we all have opportunities to open our doors to those in need, that we all encounter suffering we could choose to alleviate, and that the legacy we leave is determined not by what we accumulate, but by how we love. If the story of Ruth Miller raising Marcus and Darius Washington has moved you, challenged you, or inspired you to reconsider what family means and what love requires, please take a moment now to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that their sacrifices matter, that chosen family is real family, that love transcends all the boundaries we construct, and that individual acts of kindness can ripple outward to transform communities and inspire generations. Ruth Miller's decision to open her door to two grieving children created a legacy that has now touched millions of lives. Her story proves that we all have the capacity to be heroes in someone else's story if we simply choose to see human need and respond with love rather than indifference. Your engagement helps ensure this powerful message reaches more people who need to hear it, more people who might be inspired to become the Ruth Miller in someone else's life. The revelation that Ruth Miller, an elderly white woman dismissed and avoided by her neighbors, had quietly raised Thomas Washington's sons for 14 years without compensation stands as one of the most powerful testimonies to sacrificial love ever shared. Her choice defied social expectations, transcended racial barriers, and demonstrated that family is created not through biology, but through daily acts of care, sacrifice, and unconditional love. Thomas's decision to trust her, Marcus and Darius's flourishing under her care, and their reciprocal devotion to Ruth in her final years created a beautiful circle of love that challenges every assumption about what families should look like and reminds us that the highest human calling is simply to love one another well.